peer learning, your developer adoption safety net. When we write docs for developer tools, we take a snapshot of our understanding of our software, we put it into the world, and we hope it matches enough of our users' understanding for it to make them productive. As we go, we often bump up against the reality that new ways to use our software, or new ways for people to misunderstand how to use our software, are almost as vast as the number of developers there are in the world. Docs are a form of automation, and automation needs exception handling because it can't preempt every possible use case. Fortunately, you can build a social system to provide that exception handling for your project. When people help each other get better at your tool, this creates a stickiness factor to your developer experience. You want things like your repo, your README, your tutorials to onboard your users. And then you want your users to get each other back when they fall off. Developers look for evidence that this is already happening before diving in with your project. You've probably seen this yourself in your own adventures, because how much do you weigh the activity of a community of users and contributors when you're selecting a tool or framework? Because, as it's been said, in programming, you never want to Google a problem and find out you're the world's foremost expert. And a lot of developers like teaching their peers because it demonstrates mastery and it forces clarity in the mental model for how a tool interacts with larger systems. And I want to take a moment together to think through how we land in this workflow of helping each other in the first place. When we run into a problem with our code, we often debug it by searching for error content in Google. When we do, if we're lucky, search results bring us to posts from other developers who have run into similar problems and found their way out. Their public debugging processes, with additional passersby chiming in, makes a paper trail as they go in places like Stack Overflow or project-specific support forums. Someone just a little bit deeper into the problem space may have helpful insight for whoever's coming up right behind them. And a good ecosystem makes it possible to assemble the puzzle pieces, to solve problems, and get back into action quickly. Externally, big rewards like speaking gigs or landing pull requests in high-profile projects definitely keep folks at it once they're in the groove of acting as helpers. But initially, they're helping because it makes them better at the work and because it's satisfying to alleviate shared pain. If you're stuck on a programming problem, it's usually because you just haven't met the right people yet. Technical knowledge gaps are actually network gaps. So what happens when developers using your product help each other out when they get stuck? Every new tool has a learning curve, and when your users get stuck, the longer it goes on, the more frustrated and discouraged they become. Stay in the red too long, and they may move on and try an alternate approach that doesn't include your project. And conversely, getting unstuck quickly restores them to the satisfaction of a flow state, where they feel great because the problems they're facing are tractable and satisfying. Programming, as we all know, can be high friction. In particular, adopting new technologies presents meaningful barriers to entry as developers have to learn new APIs, design patterns, and figure out how to deal with new constraints. When we don't know the solution, but everyone else around us seems to, it's unnerving. Things compound, so we're facing not just the technical problem, but also leaking cognitive CPU, wondering whether we're capable or whether we'll ever find our way out. So if you can get a hand from another helpful human, it interrupts this loop. It's isolation on the one hand and relief on the other. And these are real relationships that form up. My friend Dave told me a story about how soon after he graduated from school, he was doing a freelance job where he had to work with microcontrollers and he was just lost. He found this one IRC chan, started asking questions, and this one person said, okay, well, we're going to figure this out. They went back and forth for 2 weeks. My friend was based in Brazil, and this helpful stranger was in Austria, working in the AV department of an opera company. They talked about getting Dave a job there at the opera company doing tech, and Dave's relationship to microcontrollers was permanently changed. And your team can create these positive associations. I've been lucky to do UX research into peer support communities. And I found that when a new person receives help from a project lead or a staff member, it has a particularly large and positive impact. I spoke to one young bootcamp grad who was simply over the moon when a team member at the company I was working for helped him debug because they were treating him like a worthy contributor who was worth their time. What he said to me was, it was the first time I felt like part of the developer community. What about your business? So, broad strokes, the more people feel like your tool gives them superpowers, the more they talk about your tool. The best marketing campaign in the world pales in comparison to the impact of your users telling the world your project made them a better version of themselves. And in this game, grassroots advocacy is everything. So think about it. What would happen if your users blogged about their use case of your product, or published tutorials, or spent time helping others navigate known issues that your team hasn't patched yet, or started consultancies selling their expertise in your product, or lobbied their managers to let them use your product in their day job? With enough of a flywheel going, a healthy peer learning community de-risks the decision to adopt your technology before you ever try to make a sale. Let's get down to brass tacks. Here's how to think about practices and systems to implement so you can have this too. I want to start by framing for you that a healthy peer learning community requires balancing opposing needs against scarce resources. You need both askers and answerers. You need strangers to show up and engage in fairly consistent and constructive ways. Fundamentally, this requires managing an economy of social capital with volunteers who don't all want the same thing. Every successful technical community has spent countless hours negotiating these dynamics. I would be misleading you if I told you it was easy. It's not easy, but as we've discussed, it's powerful. To start, define your parameters and get completely clear on the purpose of the peer learning community you want to create. Let's start by talking about what this is not. Today, we are not talking about your GitHub repo. Instead, our focus is on a user-to-user support community, which sits adjacent to the code collaboration taking place in your repo. Peer debugging between users and code collaboration between maintainers are distinct interactions, and while these spaces will eventually see crossover, let's separate out concerns. Next, this is not a social watering hole, and that might sound confusing. I just told you the story of my friend who received life-changing help from a microcontroller expert, leading to a real friendship. You might be thinking, don't I want that too? You do, but there's a catch. It's far too common for folks to reach directly for the friendships and the good vibes when building user communities, while overlooking that solving hard problems together is what helps these dynamics between people form in the first place. Think about it. It's only once you go through something with someone that you really get to know them. So don't put the cart before the horse. If you want your users to form meaningful relationships, start by setting them up to solve tangible problems and do hard things together. And what about what this space is? First and foremost, this is a place for folks to become more sophisticated technologists. Second, it's a place for users to ask and answer how do I questions. Finally, it's a place for maintainers and your team to jump in when there are high leverage opportunities to engage. For example, high-level design conversations so that you can keep those out of GitHub issues because you're not ready to formulate a pitch yet. Or moments when a user's question presents a larger opportunity to teach the whole community about some part of your software's underlying functioning or philosophy. Or perhaps there's a newcomer who shows a lot of promise and your team has the bandwidth to do a little mentoring. Because as we've discussed, when new users get help from project leaders, it makes an enormous impact. Choose your software and consider the second-order consequences of your choice. First, while it can be tempting to spin up a number of peer support channels in an attempt to invite as much engagement as possible, I recommend spinning up just one at a time so that your helper's attention doesn't get spread too thin. Decide between static forums, where conversations can be indexed by search engines, versus entirely chat-based communities. There's a trade-off between fluidity and discoverability to be made here. When I work with folks, I recommend static forums because they enable you to build a shared knowledge base as you go that both saves time for your helpers in the immediate term and draws in users in the future. If you do opt for a completely chat-based community, it's going to be harder to build a knowledge base for your helpers to refer to. This can leave them constantly on the defensive, so you'll need to devise other ways to easily surface community knowledge so they're not answering the same questions over and over. Let's think about the people involved. When we know what's driving folks, we can keep them engaged. Let's break these down into 3 broad groups, and in any project you'll be able to go far deeper, more granular, but to start for now, let's think about new users. And what they want is reliable debugging help. They are looking for progress towards mastery, and they want to feel worthy of other people's time, like worthy technical contributors. And then your power users, who will do more answering, want to be recognized for what they're already bringing through things like access to maintainers, the ability to land pull requests in projects, or speaking gigs. And they want these things to ultimately result in advancement in their careers. And then finally, maintainers and staff want to run a wildly successful project while also minimizing overwhelm, because there are only so many of them and so many hours in the day. House rules and social norms. Let's talk guidelines. First, decide what level of questions are welcome in your support community. Are all beginner questions fair game, or are you really only there to help more advanced users? Helping all levels of users will fuel broader growth over time, but increase the complexity to be managed in the present. Once you've decided, let people know. It'll save you headaches. Next, what are the responsibilities of those both giving and receiving help? Many communities deal with accepting all levels of questions by requiring some minimum viable effort on the part of askers for a question to be addressed. Things like explaining what they've already tried, why, and showing some code and console output. It's okay to require people to help me help you. By the same token, many communities expect answerers to uphold some baseline respect for askers, while still normalizing that not every problem can get solved. Saying, I'm sorry, I think we've gone as far as we can here. At this point, I recommend asking your DBA, is very different than telling someone they should never touch their terminal again. Another thing to consider is how to turn noobs into helpers. These are volunteers, and some churn is normal and healthy. That means you want to get noobs stepping in sooner without causing all-out pandemonium. You can do this by establishing that it's okay to guess a little on someone else's answer, as long as you admit you're guessing, and then normalize power users stepping in to add to beginners, yes and style. What's off topic for your community? So since the purpose of this space is helping folks become more sophisticated technologists by getting better at your tool, the vast majority of interactions should be directly about that. You have to choose the right blend of pleasantries and getting down to details for your community, but make sure that your search results don't get diluted for future users, whatever you do. Finally, what does it look like to reward members and create a sense of progression? Depending on your software and your ability to customize it, enabling users to gain more and more abilities to help maintain the community can work well. You can work to give your biggest helpers access to jobs leveraging their expertise in your product. Another great option is a secret clubhouse approach, where trusted helpers have access to each other and project leads. You can and must set expectations, or your community may grow into something you wouldn't want to join. Finally, get your team in there. They are your seed crystal. You need your team to put in the first bits of energy into the system, because interaction with them and proximity to them is what motivates everyone else. But your team's time is a scarce resource. That's why it's going to be crucial to work with your team to select for the interactions where they can have the most impact as the community grows. And we spoke a bit about those before. Things like high-level design discussions outside the weeds of implementation-oriented issue threads and mentoring savvy noobs are both good candidates. A support community alongside your project repo can decrease the burden on your team if you help them engage deliberately. The other way to help them is to allocate actual time in their days and weeks to do this as part of their jobs. That makes this sustainable. As you grow and maintain your project, the practice of making your decisions explicable as you go via a peer learning community to people with different contexts than you will guard against a future where noobs and experienced folks are incapable of communicating because the context gap has grown too wide, which places a cap on your adoption. In other words, socialization of errors reduces their overhead. This is an infrastructural investment in your software's future, and the effort will yield some of the best developer experience optimizations you could hope for. You can have the adoption curve you need if you create a stage for your users to level each other up. A successful peer learning community starts as exception handling and properly nurtured grows into a powerful moat to defend your ecosystem for years to come. Docs or automation? Automation needs exception handling. You can build this. Be thoughtful, put in the time, take care of your people. You'll be amazed at what your efforts yield. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was an incredible, incredible talk. Whilst I was listening to you, it honestly brought back a lot of like flashbacks in firstly when I was first getting into software engineering roles. So being the newbie and then trying to create that peer learning support group for myself, but also when I decided I wanted to try and contribute to open source. So this was a fantastic talk. It sort of brought that all together. So yeah, like I'm if anyone has any questions in for Anna, please leave them in the comment section and I will bring them up. I do have a couple of my own, if that's okay, for us to sort of dive into for the next few minutes. So my first so my first question is you talked about what's creating a community, trying to avoid creating a community that you wouldn't want to be a part of, that you wouldn't want to get involved in because it's turned sour. What happens when your community does turn into something you don't want to be a part of anymore? Is there a way for you to how do people navigate this? Is there a way for you to just change it so that you can almost go back to whatever mistake you made in the past that caused that community to go sour? I don't think personally I've never been in part of like a group or a community that has turned sour per se, but I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that.
So when first to answer the first part of your question, when a community goes sour, I would say in broad strokes, there is inevitably one thing that is happening, which is, I spoke in this talk to two broad user groups, your noobs and your power users, and it can break down amongst many or any different kind of group. But when things have arrived at such a point that the two groups cannot possibly communicate because so many negative associations and negative experiences are already built up and compounded in their brain that it's simply a foregone conclusion. The ability to get through to each other is basically lost. So, broad strokes, that's the circumstance we're trying to avoid. Yeah. Whether you can roll it back, let me tell you, prevention is always going to be vastly so much better. But I guess to think about, basically don't let it get there in the first place is my first advice. But if it has, and once it has, you will need to spend a ton of cycles on conflict resolution, number one. And depending on the software you're using, you will need to actually implement software and features to shift the user experiences of both groups to reduce the friction they're experiencing of each other. And so if you have a lot of time and you have a lot of money to throw at that, then great, have at it. It can be done with enough cycles.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the answer I was sort of after, like prevent it at all costs before we go back and try and roll back anything. But yeah, thank you so much for that. We have another question from the audience, from Josh, who's asked, what do you recommend for static solutions to knowledge management over dynamic chat only type solutions?
In my work, I have worked with Discourse a couple of different times and been reasonably happy with it. So a lot of the time, that's my go-to if someone is looking for a recommendation for a static knowledge-based solution.
Yeah, that's such a good it is a good like platform. We at Gitpod, I think Josh is aware because he's also part of the Gitpod community. We actually removed Discourse in favor of chat only, just because managing the community was quite difficult. It was sort of getting out of hand, so it was we decided to opt in just for chat only, but it is something we are exploring again in the future. So it's very, very good. Amazing. There's some more chatter around around your talk. So I just wanted to show this one just as a comment. Overloaded terminology can also manifest and be a blocker to communication between groups with wide variety of technical drift in terms of background knowledge. Totally agree. Totally agree.
100%. And if I may, that's why I, as I was rounding out the talk, I spoke to, there's a reality where, there's a potential reality where your people who are very, very experienced with your software have been stepping around missing stairs of implicit knowledge for so long that it's not even possible to articulate it to other folks. And so what I'm in large part encouraging and advocating here is to practice communicating to people with very different contexts from you and at very different experience levels from you early and often, because it'll help prevent that state and it'll keep things from calcifying.
Yeah, totally. And I don't think we have any more questions. If you do have a quick one, throw it in the chat. But I do have one more for you, Anna, before you drop off. And that is, how do you enforce or like shape those house rules and social norms? Because it feels like it's one of those things that's easiest to say and say, oh yeah, you just need to go in and act as, the more you, what am I trying to say? The way you act will then pass on to other people and they sort of understand how they should act. But is there anything like in terms of like one piece of advice you would recommend as a direct action to help shape those house rules?
I think I can think of two things. One is get used to difficult conversations. This is a long-term, like if you are trying to grow with your users, you are going to be dealing with one another as human beings. And any relationship that matters over the long term has been through its share of trials and is stronger for it. So that's sort of the table stakes, first off. And then I would say, broad strokes, praise in public and criticize, give constructive feedback in private.
That's really good. That's a really good point, actually. Yeah, you've oh, there's another comment here. I really like this one. Get used to candid vulnerability.
I like that.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, no, those are really good. I think I was going to say the thing you said about getting used to difficult conversations. That's something definitely we need to. I mean, personally, I'm relating it to my own piece of work, and yeah, that's definitely something I could relate to.
And I have one more for you.
Let's go.
Your team needs to have enough of a united front that any one person is not alone out there.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's the perfect way to end that, Anna. Thank you so much for joining us for DevExConf. And I will leave all of your details in case anyone wants to connect with you. But thank you again. And we're super excited and happy that you joined us today.
Thank you for having me.